All right, good morning. So today we're going back to the Gemara finally. The next piece of the Gemara is the halacha of swallows matzah, swallows maror without tasting it. And then once we learn, it's, I hope I've been talking about this moment for a long time. I hope it's not going to be underwhelming. No, it's an interesting subject. It's an interesting subject, as they all are. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn that section of the Gemara, and then we're going to go to that section of the Shulchan Aruch. When we get to that section of the Shulchan Aruch, I'm going to back up a bit because there's a few halachas there that are um, related to the extension of the bracha maror karpas, the karpas maror bracha extension, which we learned that earlier, but it's a different element that we covered partially, but we didn't cover in the Shulchan Aruch. So, but in the Shulchan Aruch it precedes the halachas of swallowing matzah. So we're going to learn the Gemara about swallowing matzah, go to the Shulchan Aruch, but in the Shulchan Aruch we're going to back up to the laws of the extension of
Piggybacking.
the piggybacking of the maror to the karpas, and then we'll go to this halacha of swallowing
And the carpets
karpas to maror,
to the carp.
maror to karpas, karpas to maror, and then we'll get to the halachas of swallowing the matzah and maror without tasting it. So to understand these halachas is a very simple principle. It's the kuftes vav mit beis. It's 115b, and in the middle of the page you'll see a little dalid next to the word bala. In the middle of the line, that's where we are. Amar Rava. Rava says bala. Okay. So the principles to understand, in order to understand this Gemara, is very simple, actually. Namely, when the Torah requires you to eat these food items, is the point that you consume them or that you taste them? That's the question. And then what qualifies as consumption? Those are the questions. So two questions. Is it a question of taste versus consumption? Question one. And question two, how do we qualify consumption? That's what the questions are. And it's a couple of lines and everything will become clear when we understand that. So Omar Rava said, Bala matzah, if a person swallowed matzah without chewing it, so he just like swallowed it directly, I don't know if let's say crumbled it up and then just swallowed it. Okay, our matzah is very hard and like difficult to swallow and dry, difficult to swallow without chewing. But in the old days, the matzah could have been softer. The Yemenites till today, that's right. The Yemenites today, dafka make it soft, kind of like a lafa or something like that, like a pita. Could have been like that, and only the size of an olive. It's not so much, and you just swallow it without chewing. So says Rava, if you did that with matzah yotzi, you fulfilled your obligation. Because when it comes to matzah, we don't require taste; it's consumption. So even if you didn't spend the time to taste it on your palate because you didn't chew, and like when you chew, the flavors of the food come out and you start to taste them, you just swallow them, that's fine because you consume the matzah, and that's what the Torah requires of you, to consume it, not to taste it. But by contrast, bala marar, if a person swallowed marar without tasting it, lo yatsa, he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. Because when it comes to marar, the Torah is concerned that you taste the bitterness. That's the point. To experience the bitterness of the flavor. So you have to chew it, let the flavors inside burst and come out and feel that bitterness. That's the point. Yeah. And therefore, bala matzah marar, if you consume matzah and marar simultaneously. Now let's assume, no, you didn't chew it, you swallowed. You swallowed without chewing.
Right.
And let's assume
you're putting them all together as like
as hello, but you're swallowing it. Now let's assume that he's referring to temple times, and therefore the marar doesn't ruin your matzah because they're both biblical. Option A. Then I'll give you option B in a second, but let's just do that model for a second, where matzah and maror are both biblical because it's temple times, and now you consume them both at once without chewing it. So then what would be the halacha? Yidei matzah yard. yatzah, the obligation to eat matzah that you did because you consumed it. And again, when it comes to matzah, we're concerned with consumption. But yidei maror, the obligation for maror lo yatzah, you didn't fulfill because we're concerned with taste. And you didn't taste it because you swallowed it. Okay. That was option A, to understand that we're talking about parting the maror and the matzah together, and it's biblical error. They're both biblical. It's in temple error, and therefore they're both biblical and not nullified. However, Tosfos challenges this a little bit because Rava is a scholar of the Babylonian era, 2-3 generations into the Gemara, which means he's probably not talking about temple times. Now, if that's the case, he shouldn't fulfill anything. Maror he shouldn't fulfill because what? Because he didn't chew it, he didn't taste it, he consumed it, didn't taste it.
Right, even though he did it separately.
And they put it together. Remember, he put them out. This is up the third case here.
He's allowed to though, because
what? Because what?
Because you're diluting.
Oh, so seemingly he shouldn't fulfill anything. He doesn't fulfill the matzah because he swallowed it without chewing,
Right.
And he doesn't fulfill the maror because he swallowed it without chewing, and he shouldn't fulfill the matzah because the maror ruins the matzah, because the maror is rabbinic. Tosfos responds by saying no. In such a case, it's an awkward case, because in this case you actually do fulfill the matzah because the maror didn't ruin your flavor of matzah. Why didn't your maror ruin your matzah? Because you didn't taste it. The problem with two mitzvahs ruining each other when one's of a lower standard, right, a rabbinic mitzvah ruining a biblical mitzvah, is when the flavor ruins each other. And here, because you didn't really do maror properly, i.e. you didn't chew it and taste it, therefore it didn't have a chance to ruin the matzah. And therefore you fulfilled the matzah, but you didn't fulfill the mitzvah of maror because you didn't chew it and didn't taste it. So therefore option B is we are talking about post-temple era, and yet the question of the maror of a lower standard ruining the matzah of a higher standard is irrelevant because you didn't taste it,
Right.
And it only gets ruined when you taste it. That's the case here.
That's
so because you didn't taste
the matzah.
That's right. So by not tasting it, you saved your matzah. Had you tasted it and chewed it, your maror would have ruined your matzah. Right? But and in that case, you would have fulfilled your mitzvah of maror, but not matzah. Your matzah you wouldn't have fulfilled because your maror flavor ruined your matzah. And your maror you would have fulfilled because it's a rabbinic mitzvah and it doesn't get ruined by a higher standard, it only gets ruined by a lower standard. At least according to the Levi and others. But in this case, because you didn't taste the maror, therefore you didn't fulfill the obligation of maror, and you didn't ruin your matzah because you didn't taste it. And therefore you do fulfill your obligation of matzah. Because you swallowed without chewing. Okay, now here comes.
And you don't need taste to fulfill the mitzvah matzah.
You don't need taste for matzah, you just need consumption. So that's for question A. Are we concerned with consumption or taste? Answer, matzah we want consumption, maror we want taste. And therefore maror requires chewing, matzah doesn't require chewing. Yeah? Okay. It's actually
maror still probably needs some level of consumption as well, though, right?
Oh, so now the question is what's considered consumption? Right. So first of all, there's the amount, which you're eating an olive size, but there's another concern when it comes to consumption, which is as follows. Karchan besiv. Let's say you wrapped it in sieve is as Rashbam explains for us, is like the leaf of a palm tree, which you can consume. So you wrapped it now. You hid the matzah or the maror, let's say both. Or let's go with the matzah, because maror, you for sure don't fulfill your obligation with maror because you didn't chew it and taste it. Let's say matzah. You took your matzah and you wrapped it in this little leaf. Ubalon, and now you swallowed it without chewing it. Says the Rava, afide matzah, lo yot nami lo yatsa. Even the obligation for matzah you haven't fulfilled. Because this doesn't constitute consumption. Because it didn't even go through your throat. Right? That's what I was saying before. There's a question of.
It's not a question of taste.
It's a question of consumption.
By the leaf.
That's right.
Consumption issue. Because there has to be.
So as Rashbam says it, you have to have the substance of matzah in your mouth.
Okay.
But you didn't have that.
Right.
You didn't have that. And therefore, even matzah you didn't fulfill because it doesn't constitute consumption. right? So that's question. That was question
Consumption
2.
is not only a question of the amount, quantity.
It's not
also a matter of
right.
the
The
matter
question.
of which it's eaten.
The question exactly. The question of consumption. That's just a question of whether you have the right amount. It's not even a question about whether it made it to your stomach. It's a question about of if your mouth consumed it, and you didn't. Your mouth didn't consume it. That's what Rashbam puts
Well,
it.
that's true because in biology, digestion starts in the mouth. Saliva is the first point of breakdown.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Even if you don't chew.
No, the saliva itself is starting to break down.
Very interesting. Okay, so this is the Gemara. There are different variants of the Gemara. It's exactly how to read this Gemara. The Rashbam cites the 2 different readings, but we're just going to go with this simple reading that's expressed here. We'll see now the Shulchan Aruch a little more nuance when we get there. But a question that doesn't get covered here in the Gemara, and we'll see now the Shulchan Aruch, but I'll just put it out there and see what you think. What if you wrapped your matzah inside your maror? Is that considered consumption or not?
I think for the same reasons not.
Because the Gemara said that's not in your mouth.
The mouth is not participating in the consumption of the mouth.
If that's the case, why did the Gemara choose this example of wrapping it in a leaf? But say you wrapped it in lettuce. Lettuce is maror. That's much more plausible than wrapping it in a leaf.
Then you have the issue of the dilution of the matzah issue, no?
Well, you didn't chew, you swallowed. So you didn't dilute it with flavor because you didn't chew. So you wrapped it in lettuce. So why did the Gemara using this example of wrapping it in a sieve, in this leaf, instead of saying just wrapped it in the maror itself, you wrapped it in lettuce?
Because maybe one would come to think that, if you wrapped it in marrow, it would be okay.
Okay, and the answer is actually might be. It actually might be. Okay. So we'll see. It actually might be, and we'll see why in a second. We'll see when we get to the Shulchan. But this is a question that remains unanswered, at least as far as the direct line of the Gemara goes.
It still remains unanswered because you're saying it might be okay.
Because precisely because of the fact that the Gemara chose a sieve as an example, chose a leaf as an example. Why choose a leaf? It's such a strange example to use. But the Gemara uses that specifically, as opposed to just saying you wrap it in the lettuce.
It's a non-food item generally, or was it a food
item?
Oh,
it's a non-food item. And there's the key. It's only a non-food item that constitutes a separation between your food and your mouth. But if you have a food item separating between your food and your mouth, it would be considered okay, which means if you wrapped your matzah inside of lettuce, you actually you will have fulfilled your matzah mitzvah, not your maror because you didn't taste it, but your matzah you will fulfill because that constitutes consumption. This is what we're going to see now to the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so now let's actually go to the Shulchan Aruch, right? So, but just to recap, we have 2 questions: consumption and taste. And when it comes to maror, we're concerned with taste. You got to chew. When it comes to matzah, we're concerned with consumption, and consumption means your mouth, throat, and stomach engage with it. And therefore, if your matzah is wrapped in leaf, which is not a food item, it constitutes a separation, and therefore it constitutes separation between the matzah and your mouth, and therefore that's not considered consumption, even though it made it to your stomach.
Well, like you said, maybe an exception to that if it's a food.
So that's not clear in the Gemara, but we'll see that in the Shulchan.
Right. Right. We're talking Gemara.
That's correct. Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording and restart it, and we open the Shulchan Aruch, so that way it comes out in 2 videos, and it's easier for putting them in the various playlists.